When Mark first laid his eyes on the strange shape inside the ice, his breath caught in his throat. There, behind the translucent wall deep in a frozen cavern in Greenland, was a shadow large, still, and unmistakably humanoid. He had ventured out alone, with only the bare essentials packed on his back, into a part of the Arctic that had been unreachable for centuries. His goal had been simple: to explore what climate change might be revealing beneath the melting glaciers. What he found, however, would take his name from obscurity to the pages of history. Mark had always dreamed of making a discovery that mattered. A trained physicist in his 30s, he had grown tired of labs and lectures. Instead, he found excitement in raw nature and the untouched wilderness. He had read reports of ancient ice caves thawing out across Greenland and became obsessed with the idea that something important might be hidden there. With careful planning and determination, he set off on a solo expedition, traveling for days on foot across rough, frozen terrain. Each step was grueling, each night colder than the last. But Mark pressed forward, driven by the hope of discovery. After nearly 2 weeks of navigating treacherous terrain and ice-covered ridges, Mark stumbled upon what seemed like a rock formation. It was not much at first, just a small outcrop pushing out from the snow. But as he got closer, he noticed something unusual: an opening, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. Cold wind was seeping out, and Mark felt a sudden jolt of curiosity and dread. Was it a tunnel? A cave? He had to know. Despite being exhausted and low on supplies, Mark decided to take a brief look inside. He knew it was risky, especially with no communication signal for days, but his curiosity overruled caution. Mark crawled through the narrow passage, his heart racing. As he moved deeper, the tunnel began to widen. The walls glistened with ice so dense and blue it looked like glass. The deeper he went, the more incredible the sight became. After minutes of crawling and stumbling, the space opened into a vast cavern. He stood still, stunned by what he saw. This place had been untouched for thousands of years. It was frozen silence, a world preserved in time. But what truly caught his attention was the wall. One section of ice looked different. Behind it, a shape loomed. He reached out and touched the ice. Beneath the layers was the form of something tall, something humanoid. It looked like it had arms, a head, and maybe even legs. The details were blurry, hidden beneath the frosted surface. Mark's heart pounded. Was this the frozen body of a creature? Could it be a prehistoric animal, or even an ancient human? He couldn't say for sure, but he knew he had found something unique. The excitement was overwhelming, and for a moment he just knelt there in silence, staring at the shadow behind the ice. Mark knew he couldn't do this alone. He had to return to town, get help, and document the find properly. Before leaving, he took out a small notebook and sketched the layout of the cave, marking the entrance and the ice wall. He then made the difficult climb back to the surface, his body aching and his mind spinning. It was already dark by the time he reached the open air. He set up his tent, ate the last of his food, and spent a restless night thinking about the shadow. He dreamed of it coming to life, of it watching him through the ice. The next morning, Mark began the long 2-day journey back to the nearest settlement. Every step was a test of endurance. He braved freezing temperatures, snowstorms, and the constant fear of getting lost. When he finally reached the town, he immediately set out to gather help. He told the locals only that he had found something frozen in the ice and needed assistance excavating it. He avoided giving too many details, fearing that others might try to claim credit for his discovery. Still, a group of strong and curious volunteers agreed to help, drawn by the promise of adventure and a generous payment. They packed snowmobiles with tools, food, and gear and set out early the next morning. Mark guided them as best as he could using the landmarks he had memorized, but fresh snowfall had changed the landscape. What was once clear was now buried under white. For hours they searched without success. Doubt began to creep in. Just when they were about to turn back, one of the workers struck something solid with a stick. It was the entrance. They had found it again. The team carefully descended into the cave. Mark led the way, his excitement building with every step. Soon they reached the massive chamber, and there it was, the ice wall and the dark figure behind it. The locals gasped. No one had expected this. Mark handed out tools, and they began to chip away, slowly and cautiously. The ice was thick and ancient. Every strike echoed through the cave. Hours passed, and they made only slow progress. Suddenly, a loud crack rang out. A worker had hit a weak spot, and the ice wall fractured. Everyone froze. Then the ice collapsed. Behind it, instead of a body, was a stone wall. On it was a massive painting of a humanoid figure, bold and dark. As the ice melted further, more images appeared, scenes of people hunting, animals running, fires burning. Mark was stunned. He had not discovered a creature, but something possibly even more valuable: prehistoric cave art preserved by ice for thousands of years. The group stood in silence, staring at the wall. The paintings looked similar to those found in France or Spain, but no one had ever seen anything like this in Greenland. The implications were huge. It suggested that ancient people had traveled or even lived in this region long before anyone had thought possible. Mark realized he needed to alert the scientific community right away. This was bigger than him. This was history. Over the next few months, news of the discovery spread across the globe. Archaeologists, glaciologists, and historians came to see the site. The cave was declared protected, and only approved researchers were allowed to enter. Dating techniques showed the art could be more than 10,000 years old. The pigments used included charcoal, red ochre, and even traces of moss. Experts began to piece together the story of the people who had created the images. Were they travelers, hunters, early settlers? No one could say for certain yet, but the questions were exciting. Mark was credited as the discoverer and invited to speak at conferences and universities. Though he didn't earn money from the find, the recognition was more than enough for him. His story was told in magazines, documentaries, and even school textbooks. He had set out to find a mystery frozen in ice and returned with a connection to humanity's deep past. He often said he still remembered the feeling when he first saw the figure behind the ice. It felt like time itself had paused, like he had found a message from the ancestors. To this day, the cave remains one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries in recent history. It stands as a reminder that the Earth still holds secrets, hidden in the most unlikely places, waiting to be uncovered. As ice continues to melt in the Arctic, new finds may emerge. But for Mark, nothing will ever compare to that moment deep underground, alone with the cold, staring at the ancient face behind the ice.